On this episode of the Last Wire podcast, we'll be talking about the missing cowboy Ben Tyner and the role that amateur radio played in his search effort. Ben Tyner, a Wyoming cowboy last seen riding into the mountains of British Columbia, Canada on January 26, 2019. As a working cowboy, he vanished from the Merritt area, and his abandoned horse was found fully saddled on the Forest Service Road northwest of the city 2 days later. An extensive search by volunteers and police on foot, horseback, in helicopters, and on snowmobiles found no trace. This region presented some communication challenges that had the potential to delay search efforts. Thanks to local hams, this issue was addressed. We're now joined with Victor Echo 7, Foxtrot Sierra Romeo. Welcome to the show, Myles.
Thanks, John. I'm glad to be here.
Myles, can you take us back to January and how you got involved in the search effort as an amateur radio operator?
Sure. Yeah. In January 2019, I got received a phone call from one of the emergency managers here at Emergency Management BC in Kamloops, saying that they had an active search and rescue operation ongoing for a missing cowboy, and that the search and rescue groups were having a really hard time with communications, and could I go out and see what we could do to help out. So it was just, I live in Kamloops, so it was centered in Merritt, which is about 45 minutes south of Kamloops. um, I jumped in my personal vehicle, which if any of your listeners go to qrz.com and look up my page, you'll see my crazy vehicle, which I've I've uh, I've set up to be kind of a mobile emergency management BC radio room. So it's quite the eyesore from an antenna perspective, but it does allow me everything that I need to do for EMBC versus one of the government issue vehicles are actually less well equipped. So that's typically why I take my own vehicle. But I arrived on scene, which was it was in a fairly mountainous area, just sort of north. I guess it would be pretty much north of Merritt, and very kind of rugged terrain, very remote in the sense that there's a few logging roads, but there's no power, there's no people that live up there, and this was January, so lots of snow. And when I arrived and found the SAR command truck, it was in this little valley with a tiny little clearing, and I learned later that they had picked it because it was flat, and it was basically for access for helicopters. There was a good landing pad, safe landing access for helicopters, and it was also reasonably close for was, like I say, a good parking area. It was a good place to locate from a ease of perspective for helicopters landing and people parking and embarking and debarking and stuff like that. But it was an absolutely terrible place from a radio perspective. And what the search and rescue folks had discovered was that they were basically in a it's hard to describe for listeners, but if you imagine, if you put three mountains in kind of an equilateral triangle, and then you dropped the SAR truck in the middle, that's where it was. And the searchers were all on the slopes on the other sides. That was where the evidence was, where they were looking for the cowboy. And so obviously, for your listeners, simplex communications weren't going to work. And so one of the questions that they had was, could we use amateur radio communication? But unfortunately, the location of the local amateur repeaters was such that it wouldn't really work either. So, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that one of the things I think is a real value for amateur volunteers is their ability to, as good communicators, to kind of understand how that works, especially for people that aren't communications people. They're used to their cell phones working all the time, and they're suddenly someplace where they don't work. And so one of the things that had been suggested when I was sent out was that someone had said that the SAR groups had portable repeaters that could be put up on the top of these peaks that were around the SAR truck, and that would allow the SAR command truck to would repeat up to the top of the hill on the search and rescue, temporary portable repeater, and then down to the search people on the other side. The problem with that is it's wintertime and none of those mountaintops had any kind of road access. And so again, being wintertime, solar to keep those repeaters running isn't really a great option because, the day length is really short. The weather's nasty. That would have meant flying the portable repeaters, which we had. We actually had three of them. We would have had to equip a generator with each one. And so I sat in the SAR command truck with the search leader, and I talked to them and I said, hey, yes, I know you guys want to put up these portable repeaters, but here's the reality. We've got very short day length. We're going to have to be using the RCMP helicopter because that was there to help search for the missing cowboy. We're going to be using that twice a day to fly to each of these mountaintops to take a volunteer who otherwise would be searching, up to the top of the hill to check on the repeater, add fuel to the generator, make sure it was working. And that's going to take, probably, I'm not a helicopter pilot, but a couple of hours probably to do each, site twice a day. So, you figure that's somewhere 4 to 6 hours a day that in daylight, maybe that helicopter is not flying to be looking for the missing person. I thought that wasn't a really wise use of, both the communications technology has at disposal, but also the search and rescue assets that we had at our disposal. And one of the things, through my networks, because uh, I'm a nutty ham, and communications really excites me. I mean, I know lots of people in the commercial space, and so one of the things I knew was that one of the commercial companies actually had a commercial repeater on a nearby mountaintop that was actually higher than all the ones that we were in, and so I reached out to them and said, "Hey, could we use your commercial repeater, which was just outside Merritt on a high elevation site?" And I told them about the search and everything. They said, "Absolutely." The problem we had was, of course, all the SAR people have search and rescue frequencies in their radios. It'd be very problematic to suddenly try and reprogram dozens of radios. But it turns out the company not only had access to the repeater, but also had dozens and dozens of radios pre-programmed and ready to go. So I made the recommendation to the SAR team leader that we you know we do it this way, and they made the request into Emergency Management BC. Emergency Management BC checked with me, and I said, "Yep, I support this." And resource request went out, and within a couple of hours, we had enough portable radios. We worked with SAR teams to educate their team members on the radios were very similar to what they were using already, so it wasn't a big deal. We just basically equipped everyone with radios. We had big banks of chargers um, there for folks, and that was basically we were able to get effective communications between the people on the ground back to the SAR truck. There was also a secondary command post had been sent up at the Merritt Airport, just because they ran out of the number of people, they ran out of space out in the field next to the SAR truck. So that was the first. That was the first piece, John, where we basically the urgent need was to get the SAR teams who are out in the field, both for safety, so that they didn't want somebody getting lost, but also to be able to, to make that communication between the SAR teams and the SAR, command truck. And then the second piece was the SAR truck command center truck was having a hard time getting communication back and forth to Emergency Management BC. So the second piece I did, similar to the other story that I shared with you in 2017, is I used our LTE, um, Go kit, as we talked about. So EMBC now has LTE Go kits. I brought one of those out, set up the tripod, the mast, and then was able to provide the SAR truck with high-speed data communication. So they were able to make telephone calls and had internet access and stuff, so they could get back to the provincial regional emergency operations center. So that was my role in 2019 with the cowboy. Again, it in a sense it wasn't pure ham radio in a sense, but I was using all my skills as an amateur to be able to provide that um, that recommendation to the decision makers on what to do. And one of the things, I'm very proud about that, because we were able to keep that helicopter flying looking for the fellow, and not having it scooting back and forth, providing fuel to generators. So I think for me, that was one of the big takeaways from that example is, as an effective communicator, and able to um, take that information, synthesize it, and then pass it back to the decision makers. We were able to, collectively make very good use of the resources available and keep those focused on looking for the fellow.
Being a ham operator is more than just passing messages back and forth, setting up critical communication infrastructure. It's being that critical thinker. And I think this story really reflects that. They want your expertise on this mountain, not just your equipment. What are some lessons you learned, and how did you think out of the box as a ham operator?
Yeah, and I think like that to me, I think is a key that I've learned is, as a ham volunteer for an emergency organization, um, you'll often get the call that says, "Hey, I need you to go and do this." And I think the thing I always tell the people that work with me is, like, your answer is yes, I'll be right there. But the first thing you want to do when you get to wherever you're tasked is look around, ask questions, figure out what's going on. Don't just go on, like I say, it was kind of like, for me, it was like, hey, we need you to go out and, set up these portable repeaters because the SAR guys have them. And I could have done that. I could have just gone out and said, oh, okay, let's, I love to fly in a helicopter. It's fun. Um, Take me to the top of the mountain. We'll set up this portable repeater, fire up the generator. But, um, I think as a communicator, I looked at the whole situation and said, um, okay, what do we need to do here? What are the potential resources we had? And I looked at everything from, what we had as hams, so the local radio clubs, what repeaters do we have? What frequencies are they on? Where are they located? Um, like, and I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with some of the tools now online that amateur clubs use to plot, their repeaters. And I'm thinking of tools like Radio Mobile, where people will go in and say, okay, well, we're going to put a, radio on ABC Hill, and it's going to be on 14732, and it's going to be 50 watts, and it's going to use a 5 dB gain antenna. And what's our coverage pattern going to look like? Who's going to be able to use the repeater? Well, as amateurs working for public service organizations, we can use those same tools. So, if you have time, for example, you can say, oh, hey, well, if you were going to put up a portable repeater here, would it work for what you need to do? That's the kind of stuff that I think as hams, where you have that knowledge as a communicator, and all your smarts to be able to say, okay, will this work? Or for example, like we often see here in British Columbia, because of our mountainous terrain, that HF communication using NVIS antennas can be extremely effective. At all times of the day, over distances that VHF repeaters don't work. So we have HF in our Go kits, right? So we can set up NVIS antennas, and sure, it's not, it's maybe using WinLink, which is smaller email messages or voice communication. But again, it's that ability as a ham to say, okay, what's in my toolkit? What's my problem? How do I best solve it? And then take that information back to the emergency management decision makers and say, okay, this is what I recommend. This is going to be most effective for the problem that you have right here.
What's some advice you can offer new hams or people that are thinking about getting into amateur radio from an emergency communication perspective? Where do they start? What do you think they need to focus on?
For hams that are looking to get involved or volunteer with emergency organizations, take as much training as you can. I'm sure most local governments, certainly most provincial governments, they have training programs. Like here in BC, we have a very well developed program. And so get yourself familiar with how emergency operations centers work, how the decision making process works. Participate in exercises, because you're going to find yourself in, and again, like I might, when for the listeners, it might have seemed, oh, Myles was very calm about describing what was going on with the search for the cowboy. But I can tell you that that was actually all happening in kind of a information vacuum, in a panic. Um, it would have been very easy for me to just, as you said earlier, to just grab that portable repeater and jump in the helicopter and fly to the top of the hill. And so I think, it's really good for hams that want to get involved is, get some practice so that when you do get thrown into those situations, you can kind of keep your wits about you and think through stuff and make those, make that analysis and that critical decision and make those recommendations, because that's your super value for emergency organizations, right? Is to be able to, help them be effective, right? That, like, as I said, if you know that you're not going to, sending out somebody with a VHF radio isn't going to work, that you really need to take a deployable HF kit, because that, given your area, and this is what I tell amateurs here in BC, I say to people, practice with WinLink every, throughout the day, in the evenings, different times a year, so that that, maybe 40 meters only works certain times of the day at certain times of the year. So, because what happens again is, I think as humans, we get into a rut. And so, for example, in BC here with emergency management, we see all of our volunteers, Wednesday night is our, our practice night, right? Where we all, barring COVID, we would get together, in the radio room. We do a bunch of practice and stuff. It's always on Wednesday night, right? So what I found is some of our volunteers, they're always like, oh yes, 80 meters works great all the time, because they're only in a Wednesday night. But then they try and use it during the day on a Friday when they get called out, and they're like, well, it's not working. Why is that? So yeah, so I'm always reminding people to, they don't, EMBC doesn't mind, you can come as a volunteer, you can come down to the radio room anytime they're open. So, come in and practice at different times so that you're, so that you basically, as an amateur radio volunteer, you have this broad experience and knowledge set to draw on, so that when you're asked to provide those recommendations, you can be really effective.
No, I agree 100%. Before we wrap up, what was the final outcome for the search?
Unfortunately, he was not found, and has not been found to date. The latest information I have is that they suspect it was foul play, but I understand it's still an active investigation. So it's really unfortunate, John. But I will say, it was a tremendous effort by everyone involved, and a huge number of SAR teams came out, and RCMP and everyone. So yeah, huge effort was made. It's unfortunate it didn't have a positive outcome.
That's very unfortunate, but I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I hope to have you on again one more time. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, and feel free to share with your listeners if they want my contact information. I'm always happy to chat about my experiences, because I really do believe that amateur radio operators have a lot to offer to our public service agencies.
You've been listening to Victor Echo 7 Foxtrot Sierra Romeo. Myles, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate you taking the time to share with us your experience with ham radio and emergency communications. To our listeners, I'm your host, John Bignell, and this is another episode of the Last Wire podcast.